In the latter half of the 19th century, white settlers began migrating to the West, with high expectations of a new life and with even higher hopes of the new opportunities that lay ahead of them. However, these white settlers were disturbed with the presence of Native Americans and saw them as a threat to their futures. They believed they were uncivilized and needed to be assimilated to the superior culture of the whites. These beliefs led to government interference into the lives of the Native American people. The governmental policies from the years 1877 to 1919 significantly affected the Native Americans socially, economically, politically, and militarily. In the social category, the Dawes Act plays a large role in changing the social and cultural scope of the Native Americans. The act encouraged the Americanization of the natives and was designed to force all Indians to leave their traditional past and become farmers. The Bureau of Indian Affairs strongly encouraged assimilation and even began to target children. The federal government forced Indian children to leave their families and sent them to boarding schools with white men in charge, hoping they would learn to abandon their traditional native ways of life. Some Indians were even forced to change their names, like Onenladini, who was forced to change his name to Daniel LaFrance. This discarding of native names made the Indians feel as if they had lost themselves and their culture altogether. At these boarding schools, the natives were also not allowed to speak their respective native languages and were publicly shamed in front of their classmates if they did. In 1880, the government enacted the Civil Regulations, which banned traditional native practices like the sun dance and the medicine man. The federal government, along with Christian missionaries, wanted to ban the Indian dance ceremony due to the gory piercing of the men's chests during its performance. They saw this as torture because, as in the past, they could not understand the significance of the ceremony in relation to its spiritual importance of the tribes. The U.S. even attempted to make the Indians adopt their mode of dress, to which they highly disliked. Traditionally, the natives would bathe in the sun, and they felt as if the clothing of the whites, like the stiff collars, hats, and leather boots, was detrimental to their health. Along with the Dawes Act having a significant social impact, it also had drastic political effects on the tribes. The act aimed to break up the tribal governments and encourage individualism. The government allotted land to individual members of the tribe instead of whole tribes in their aim to break up the tribal system of the Native Americans. The Major Crimes Act of 1883 also challenged the political power of the natives. It declared that any major crime committed by an Indian was supposed to be dealt with in federal court and not within the tribe. The deteriorating economic prospects and the poverty of the Native Americans is also an effect of the U.S. policies. The government was in charge of the tribal lands and claims they acted on the best interests of the Native Americans. However, this was not necessarily true. The Indians' reservations were located on land abundant with resources, but these resources were unavailable to them due to the federal government owning of the land. Because they didn't own their land themselves, their resources led to dead capital, and it became nearly impossible for the Indians to make a steady income. Finally, the Indian military was affected by the U.S. policies as well. The Native Americans were furious with the unfair and corrupt policies of the federal government and fought back in order to preserve their lands and culture. In 1867, treaties were negotiated between the Indians and the whites in an effort to put an end to the violence, but angry military forces and land-greedy whites altered the peace shortly after. However, not all encounters between the Indians and the whites resulted in substantial Indian losses. At the Battle of Little Bighorn, the tribes planned a surprise attack on George Custer and his army and managed to kill every man. Despite a decisive victory, the natives were incapable of retaining their troops due to the lack of political structure. Eventually, the troops broke away from each other and were returned to their reservations by the United States Army. This marked the end of the military power of tribes like the Sioux.